in London, and Jackson Janes, who's with me, who's from the Marshall Fund in the United States and a very close observer of US-German transatlantic relations. I'll just start right with you. That speech by JD Vance lecturing the Europeans on what democracy should really mean, questioning whether institutions are really necessary, essentially. Is that the voice of America right now, or what did we hear?
It's the voice of some of America, I think, at this point. He was essentially explaining how the message from Trump is, we are the movement here, and we encourage a movement there, the populist movement that he represents. And I think to some extent that was something that was designed to be shown on American television as well as here in Europe, to make sure that he's performing the exercise that Mr. Trump has given him as much as that.
Peter, you're actually in the process, if I understand it right, of writing a book on populism, what the populists want in Europe. You texted, you tweeted on this already. What is your take on what we're seeing unfold here?
Yeah, so it was pretty much populism 101. It was pretty much how you would expect to write a newspaper column. It was a New York Post column, essentially, that he read out. And on that basis, I think it was a wasted opportunity. It was a wasted opportunity. He could have used this opportunity where literally every European defense security person is watching to explain what is going to be the approach by the Trump administration. What are the rules? What do we expect from you? What's going to happen if our expectations are not met? If that had happened, we would be busy all day today discussing, what can be accepted, what do we not disagree with? There would be disagreement. So he angered Europe, but he didn't divide Europe. Actually, as a consequence of the speech, Europe is pretty much divided against him. He could have been much more effective in dividing Europe, because if he had formulated an effective approach, some Europeans would have said, oh, maybe we can go along with that. Others would have said no.
Is that the aim of dividing Europe? Was that the missed opportunity?
I think he's in looking at Europe not as Brussels. He's looking at your various different members, countries, and some of them are quite friendly with Mr. Trump, as you all know, such as Hungary.
Yeah, Viktor Orban.
So I think that his preference is to work bilaterally with people. So in that respect, I think he was showing exactly what he was trying to get at. But I do think that to some extent, just to repeat what I said before, that was one voice out of the United States. There are others.
Well, he actually took bilateralism to a new level here, because the far-right Alternative for Germany party was deliberately not invited to the Munich Security Conference, and then the US Vice President has a bilateral with the leader of the AfD, Alice Weidel, just a couple of blocks away. So that is also sending a clear message. What does that tell us about how the United States, or particularly this administration, will be looking at taboos in German politics, or just red lines when it comes to democracy?
I think they're looking at weaknesses in certain parts of the governments in Europe that he can exploit. And to some extent, in that context, my sense is that he will try to do that with a particularly important focus on Germany, not necessarily because he doesn't necessarily like Germany as much as perhaps other countries like Hungary, but because of the fact that it plays a superly important role in Europe as far as organizing Europe in the context of trying to respond to Trump. And so in that respect, my sense is that he wants to work with Europe on a bilateral, one-on-one basis, and maybe even run around Brussels a bit.
Well, and Peter, I mean, what does this mean for the kind of leadership Europe will now have to show? I mean, he made these statements just a week before the elections here in Germany. He actually put the Germans particularly into position. We heard from the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, saying that he rejected this kind of notion for democracy. We heard from the chancellor, who's at the Munich Security Conference here today, that he rejects that kind of take on what democracy should be. And we heard on the man who's very likely, according to all polls, going to be the next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who said here on stage, look, we respect your elections. We expect you to respect ours. So where are we there?
So I personally don't think it will have a big impact on the elections. If you look at obviously it's very annoying. And obviously it's true that Americans don't understand, or the leadership in America doesn't understand what the AfD is as a party. They don't seem to know very much about that party. But at the same time,
seem
a
to
lot,
care, actually,
yeah,
that term, yeah.
exactly, arguably.
Yeah.
I don't think it will have any impact. A lot of voters of the AfD, especially in Eastern Germany, are deeply anti-American. They're deeply skeptical of the sort of billionaire class that Elon Musk represents. And they're very unlikely to take advice from people like Elon Musk telling them on who to vote for. So I think this will play out politically. And so Europe needs to really get its act together. And Jackson and I have been coming to the conference many, many times. My first conference was in 2009. Joe Biden became president. Everyone was very enthusiastic. But already back then, we said we have to do more in Europe. 2017, Mike Pence came, and people here said, now we really have to do more. And in both cases, nothing happened. So my fear is that we're all sitting here and we're saying, oh, Europe has to do more, and we'll all go home and nothing happens. And then it would really be Europe would have to blame itself for really missing the boat, because something really needs to happen.
And we are going to move on to Ukraine, because this really begs for the question about Ukraine in a moment. I know you will have to leave, but our NATO correspondent will be coming in a few moments. Then we'll talk about what implication that has on Ukraine. But in terms of Europe having to show leadership, and I too am a veteran almost of this conference. I've been here almost 10 times now. And the question is this really the moment that everybody was fearing? Is it like physically happening this time around? I mean, the question of a withdrawal of the United States, military support potentially, but this demands unity in Europe, which, if anything, is gravitating away from that kind of center, right?
Maybe if I
Yeah,
may.
go for it.
So the point about NATO is, I think, is actually much more dangerous than America leaving NATO. I don't think America will leave NATO. America will not say we're not going to have military forces supporting Ukraine anymore overnight. What makes NATO such an effective organization is ultimately the credible promise of the United States of America to defend Europe. The credible promise that if Vladimir Putin walks into Estonia, then America will defend Estonia just as it would defend Miami or Los Angeles. And if leaders in America, President Trump or the defense secretary or the vice president, give reasons that this promise is no longer there or is not iron cast, it creates a window of opportunity. It creates a window of opportunity for people like Putin who will say, oh, let's test what America is going to do. With previous presidents, we always knew that promise was iron cast. And with this president, I think there is a little bit of a doubt. And that's the problem, because NATO is what it is because of the credible promise of the United States.
But there the question is, of course, also what is the US defending together with the Europeans? And there we get back to, and I just want to bring you in there, that core value of democracy, freedom, the West. How was that redefined on stage here at the Munich Security Conference by JD Vance? And will that actually have traction beyond today?
I don't think he defined the West. I think he defined what it is that the United States and that administration thinks is the West. So there's a lot more to come in the debate about that in the coming years. Again, I said before, the voice that you heard on the stage was one of many voices in the United States. And so I sense that at this point, the issue is going to be, what are people in Europe going to do to respond to what I call the difference between the signal and the noise? And there's a lot of noise out there, and you heard that as Vance was on the stage. The signal, however, is that the longer adaptation in the United States, I would say over the next 5 to 10 years, will be moving around its geopolitical posture toward the Pacific and toward China. They've been telling us that for a long time. And as Peter just said, this argument that the wake-up call has come through this speech. We've had wake-up calls way before
Absolutely.
2009, actually going back to, the 60s. So this is not news. But I think that to some extent what's important is that I hear Europeans saying, now we have to do this. And the implementation is going to fall squarely, by the way, on Germany. Because of the fact that Mr. Merz presumably is going to be, as Chancellor, facing a Europe that has to respond to this whole signal and noise from Washington, D.C.
And he was on stage today, and we did actually get exactly that question from a Ukrainian MP, whether Germany or he as Chancellor will take up leadership. And in fact, there was a slip of the tongue by the presenter on stage who already addressed him as Chancellor instead of Chairman of the Conservative CDU party. But I just want to stay with dissecting the noise and the signals for a moment, Peter, because we've seen a lot of signals and noise at this Munich Security Conference. Would you just flesh out for us how much of what JD Vance brought here was signaling and what was the noise?
I agree with Jackson on the signal. I think there should have been much more substance to it, and there may have been. People are talking about on the corridors about why he didn't mention Russia, Ukraine. What are the reasons behind it? Did Trump tell him not to talk about it?
Because there's no concrete points really. What exactly they're going to do?
Exactly, and perhaps the answer is that the American administration hasn't fully figured out exactly what it wants to do with Russia and Ukraine. We had Defense Secretary 3 days ago giving a particular message. We had General Kellogg, the envoy of President Trump to the Ukraine, give a completely different message in a private meeting here, where he was very gung-ho about supporting Ukraine. So it would have been interesting. It would have been an opportunity, this conference, to clarify to European partners, what does America actually want and how does it intend to go about it? That would have been very helpful, because then we could have found a role for us, how to fit into that strategy.
If I can draw on an example, I've been coming to this program in Munich for 20 years, and I remember very vividly the 2007 Munich Security Conference when Putin got up on the stage and basically laid it all out. That's how he's going to see the world. Well, that was a catalyst, a call to arms, if you will, and a call that in many ways I think we responded well to. But the point is that right now the catalyst has to come as well from Europe, not just from the US. So when you talk about being having people listen to JD Vance and be upset with his rather focused speech on core values and cancellation and things like that, what we needed was exactly what Peter just said. We needed a blueprint. And that blueprint has now has to be coming from the Europeans as well as from the U.S.
But just to, because I know you have to go, and just to ask you one more question about this. So there's a deliberate decision taken by the vice president here in Munich to criticize what is called the firewall against the far right, instead of mapping out exactly what we just spoke about, giving more details on what the United States plans. At the same time, we had, just before this conference, this direct phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian president was informed afterwards. There is not just an air of confusion, there is real confusion on whether the US plan is to have the Europeans at the table, the Ukrainians even at the table. How much of this is chaos? And how much of this is strategy? In your take, as someone who's writing a book on populism right now.
It's a strategy of chaos, of course. I think that there are people within the administration who generally see themselves as disruptors. And they intend to overthrow assumptions about how the West is supposed to function, how it's supposed to work. They also see themselves very much as revolutionaries. So they think they are leading a global revolution, global populist revolution that is going to sweep to power all these movements just like themselves. And they are confident that in the next few years, and they may not actually be wrong about that, a number of European countries will go the way of the United States and before Hungary and other countries. And so they see themselves as leaders of that. They want to encourage it whenever they can. And they also think that as a consequence of that, the assumptions about how the world order works and who to deal with and who to have partnerships with will completely change. So they think of themselves like a lot of ideological leaders in the past. They see themselves as a sort of vanguard. And I think JD Vance is a great example of that, because he was a right-wing intellectual before he became a politician, and he's been writing about this for a number of years. So he sees himself as implementing this global revolution that ultimately the West is going to follow. He looks at people like us and sees us as the ancien regime that is going to be swept out by what Trump has triggered.
So disruption all around.
Yes.
Peter, on that note, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thanks for being
No
with
problem
us.
at all.
And we're going to rotate you out. And our correspondent in Brussels, Teri Schulz, will be joining us and giving us some insights on how that messaging is being received. In fact, thank you so much, Teri, for joining us.
So delighted to be on the podcast. Hi.
So we just mapped this out. How was this taken by NATO allies at this Munich Security Conference, according to the conversations you've had?
The JD Vance speech,
Yeah.
and the entire sort of European wake-up call, as you've been talking about it, and I agree with you that they've had many. This is just the latest European wake-up call. People were shocked. I have heard people say that they were shocked. That they also felt like it was really an affront. That he picked out these examples targeting certain countries about what the United States feels were attacks on freedom of speech or other individual freedoms. Europe definitely doesn't feel that. In fact, feels that the things that they're doing with regard to digital services and so on gives people more freedom, gives people more protection. Also, I think probably Europeans were quite confused by JD Vance's attack on, for example, the invalidation of the Romanian election due to this huge flux of disinformation. And
there was even no debate in Europe, really, about it. There was, that was
only by the
welcomed
supporters of that particular candidate
Yes.
and the supporters of, trolls having a big control over European politics. But look what happened in the United States. And I'm American for our viewers. Look what happened in the United States when supporters of Donald Trump didn't like the outcome of the election, January 6th. So I found it personally quite ironic that would be something that was criticized. At the same time, now that it's sunk in a bit, talking to people today, I just spoke with one politician from Finland who said, you know what, Monday's a new day, and Monday we really now have to galvanize ourselves. We need to get together, and we need to take this seriously, and we need to be ready to go on our own if necessary.
Yeah, please.
Well, no, I was just going to say, Teri, there's probably a memory of somewhere in the early 90s during the breakup of Yugoslavia when I think a Luxembourg or a Liechtenstein diplomat said, "This is the hour of Europe." That was 30 years ago.
Okay, well, I also heard the Foreign Minister of Spain say that under pressure and in crisis, that's the European way of doing things. So the pressure clearly is applied here right now, but there seems to be a lot of confusion which way this pressure is. We saw Volodymyr Zelensky on stage today. He had, I don't know how you felt about it, but he had even a sense of humor. But he also told Europeans quite clearly that in the conversations he's had with all the Americans, there was no guarantee that the Europeans would even be sitting at the table over the future of Ukraine. You speak to NATO allies every single day. What's the feeling what that will mean for NATO as a whole?
That's unacceptable.
Because he spoke of an alternative NATO that should be founded.
Yeah, I'm not clear exactly. He said that a couple of times now,
Yeah.
and I don't know what he means by creating a NATO inside Ukraine. So I can't answer what he means because I find that rather confusing. Allies say this is completely unacceptable, that what you're talking about with a peace plan for Ukraine also means whether there'll be peace, affects whether there will be peace in Europe, that it cannot be done. And, we've also heard that Europeans feel this will fail. If you don't have, they're expecting the Europeans to implement whatever this peace plan is, but you're not letting them have any say in how it comes about, what the steps to that would be. So the things I found most dramatic from the Zelensky speech were obviously the things that he meant to be the most dramatic, the most provocative. Vladimir Putin's the most influential leader in NATO.
Yes.
The NATO allies are not going to like that he said that. But let me also just bring up something else, and that is that sometimes some of this, not to the extent where nations are insulted or that lies are being told about what has happened in Europe, completely unacceptable, or should be unacceptable for everyone. But some of this pressure is useful for those NATO allies that are spending this amount, that do feel this very inherent threat. I just interviewed the Swedish defense minister for DW, and he said, I think the others are getting the message now. There are countries that are spending 1.2% on defense. There are countries that are now going to be spending 5% on defense. That is not unity. That is not Europe being together. And so they, the countries that are on the front line, the ones that are spending the money, that are putting in the effort, that are supporting Ukraine, want the others to do the same thing. And if they get a little bit scared now by the things the Americans are saying, that's a good thing for NATO.
Jackson, we also heard Lindsey Graham on stage. He spoke of the natural resources, a 500 billion deal. He advised basically Europeans to be all for that because it would be a deal that would make Ukraine attractive for the United States, particularly for this administration. Right. So against the backdrop of the US President Trump being described as the deal maker in chief so many times over, do you believe that that's the road ahead? Is that the way for NATO, for Ukraine to remain attractive towards the president?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's one of many particular points that could go in that direction. But it is true that that is something that he's focused on. And why is he focused on it? Because of the fact that he doesn't want China to wrap its arms around that.
Yeah.
The deep minerals that are in underneath, as far as I know, in Ukraine and also in eastern Ukraine. Why let them have free access? And so if that's going to move an American position, and there's one thing in Washington, D.C. that unites both Republicans and Democrats, and that's the animosity and the antipathy toward Beijing, then this possibly could be a potentially good thing if they're going to come up with a way of preserving an independent Ukraine.
Now, what we still don't know is when negotiations will really start. Donald Trump has left that open. He says very soon. What is your expectation? I mean, really what people want to know is when will there be peace? Under which terms? Are you any closer to getting answers on that?
No. And I think in largely measure it's because of the fact that the president is a very unpredictable human being. If he goes off and meets with Putin in Riyadh and has some form of a deal, it's no particular, I think, bet to put your money down on until you see it in really very basic terms. I think he's a very transactional person. He's got this so-called sense of friendship with Putin, whatever that might mean. So I think we will see, quite frankly, this evolving in stages over a longer period of time. Do not expect all of a sudden somebody to pick up a magic wand and say, here's peace.
Australia's former Prime Minister, Mr. Turnbull, he actually described a meeting of Trump and Putin, and he said it was tangible that Donald Trump admires Vladimir Putin. Is that the sense that NATO partners have as well? And are they any closer to anticipating what will be the next steps towards a negotiated peace?
Well, that was definitely the image in Helsinki when the two met in person. I was there, and it was very uncomfortable also for the Americans at that meeting, for the other Americans. So regarding the question of the rare earths, I think this is an interesting thing to bring up because I was in background briefings with lots of NATO ambassadors after this has resurfaced. And let's point out that Zelensky has made this point himself. Zelensky has made this offer. So this is not just coming from Trump, which makes it also much more palatable also for the European allies. This is something that Zelensky wants to do. And for me, I thought, why would it be fair that the U.S. would be paid for its assistance to Ukraine and all the Europeans are, digging deep to give everything they've got in their stockpiles? And to a person, every single one of them said, you know what, that's fine with us. Because if that's what it takes to get U.S. weapons into Ukraine, if that's what it takes to make Donald Trump consider this part of, something that he wants to protect, we're all for it. We will continue giving all of our assistance, free to Ukraine. Let's make that happen. That would be reassuring. And Lindsey Graham's speech now on stage was quite remarkable in that way. It was very common sense. And he said, we should have integrated, we the West should have integrated our economies with Ukraine after 2014. This was a huge mistake because then, we already would have had a stake that people would have felt was worth defending. And Putin would have felt like, that would happen. And that might have been a red line that he would not have crossed.
Well, the other issue is, of course, NATO membership. That option was just taken off the table by Pete Hegseth. Pretty much. Despite the promise by the last NATO gathering that there would be at least kind of a perspective on joining NATO.
Irreversible path, in fact.
Yes. Well, see, I'm already toning down after what I heard from the U.S. Defense Secretary. And on that, I thought it was also interesting that Lindsey Graham said, look, we should have done this in 2014. We should have told Vladimir Putin, do this ever again, and it will instantly mean that Ukraine becomes a member. Do you have any kind of sense of what the thinking is what could still be a path for Ukraine into NATO at this moment in time? Because we saw Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President of the European Union, almost trying to compensate for what was in the air by saying, we're going to make a fast track into the EU. We're going to speed up this process even more.
I think that should happen. I think if that's possible, that lays the groundwork. You still have two major countries that are not necessarily focusing or at least supporting the idea of NATO in membership, and one of them is the United States, and the other one's Germany. So I think as long as you have a less of a consensus on this in the NATO organization, that would be a path forward, the EU path, and to get them into the EU as soon as possible. But I do think that the issue is going to be extremely piecemeal. It's going to be an evolution. It's not going to just happen like the Treaty of Westphalia or something like that. This is going to be a period of years before we can get a handle on this.
By default, into whose hands does it play to be piecemeal about a process of securing Ukraine in the short term, which means security guarantees, but also in the long term?
To follow up on this, we should also point out one of Zelensky's most provocative lines was that the most influential leader in NATO right now is Vladimir Putin. So let's make sure that that's recorded here on the podcast. I think to follow up on that, Ukraine was never going to get in immediately. And this was always going to be a very slow process. They have a list of things they have to do, which they haven't been able to do. So what NATO allies felt was that it was just very unhelpful for Pete Hegseth to say this. It was always true, and nobody in reality would pretend it wasn't true, that Ukraine wasn't getting in immediately. Interestingly, you were already preparing for the podcast, but Mette Frederiksen, the Danish prime minister, just said on stage, you know what, my perspective is bring them in now. If we want to end this war, if we want to do this cheaply and efficiently, give NATO membership now. So this is not off the table. And it's Hegseth maybe put a damper on things. It was depressing for Ukraine and others, but I don't think they're going to go back and, say that the Washington Declaration, which you mentioned, is not enforced. They have promised Ukraine an irreversible path. There will be discussions about this because it was never a near-term reality. These security guarantees are also very unclear. How do you secure a nation at war unless you're giving them Article 5? How do you individually, bilaterally do that? Nobody knows exactly how those security guarantees can secure a nation at war unless you're sending troops in. So all of this is very murky, if not wishy-washy. I'm being nice.
Although it did strike me, I did hear that the Mette Frederiksen treated NATO membership as if it is a solution in itself.
She did.
Yes,
to some
but
extent.
that's the very reason why Angela Merkel initially actually rejected Ukraine joining NATO, because she was concerned that an empty threat that is not backed up by the security, and that means a firm commitment by the United States as the most important member of NATO to then actually take action if it's needed. And I'm just wondering, is that currently even in place, that the United States or this administration would back up its NATO promises under all circumstances to other members as well?
I think so, but it's very easily said that a president doesn't have to fool around with Article 5 or Article 4. He just has to say, well, maybe we'll have to see, or something of that sort. And that would, inject ambiguity, and that would undercut what NATO is supposed to represent. But I think that basically what I was going to say, what I said before, is that this is going to take time, and over that process to have these parallel tracks, the EU and the defense issue. How do you guarantee security for a country that is occupied by another one? I think that's going to take some very grueling, difficult work that it's going to go into, I would say, the next 5 to 10 years.
Jackson Jades, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just leave everybody with giving you the opportunity to give us one prediction of what the next meaningful step will be on the road to a negotiated peace on Ukraine.
Well, clearly, I think if that is going to happen at all, there's going to be this alleged meeting in Riyadh. However, Helsinki, as you mentioned before, I think that substance and style are going to have to be evaluated here as to what the Trump presidency is trying to accomplish. In the end, I think my prediction would be unpredictable.
Teri?
Hey, wait, that's a solo. What am I supposed to say now? I mean, I think what President Zelensky said today is that he will not accept that Trump meets Putin first. He says that he needs to meet us first. I think that what would give, I don't know if this will happen for obvious reasons, but I think what would give Europeans reassurance and Ukraine reassurance is that Trump and the Trump team meet with Ukraine first and that there are Europeans involved. That would change, that would help a lot toward everybody's belief that this could be something that works and which everybody would welcome, as long as there are Europeans at the table and that it is not Trump and Putin delivering an ultimatum to President Zelensky, which he will not accept and which will not stop the war. And then Europe is in trouble too, and they know it.
So this will be the next test for us to learn where we stand on that. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us here today for our Berlin briefing special here from the Munich Security Conference. You can catch up with us wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget our weekly newsletter, Berlin Briefing, as well. Do tune in again. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.